Hello, my presentation is about the short story Hawker by Emiliano Monge. I want to note that although it is presented as a short story, at the end there is a mention that it is actually an excerpt from Monge's forthcoming novel, Las Tierras Arrasadas, which translates to The Scorched Lands. I thought this was interesting because it places Hawker within a larger context, while the story itself is really only a snapshot. The story takes place over a very short span of time, only a few moments really, and gives rise to many questions, such as what happened to the third triplet, why is Hawker, the oldest migrant, the only one to survive, and why are the migrants being killed in the first place and by whom? However, the story provides few explicit answers. The question I came up with to explore is why does Hawker light himself on fire, presumably killing himself? Hawker's action at the end of the story contrasts with what we the readers believe he will do from the start of the story. In the beginning, he is introduced as the old man who does not understand how it is that he can still be alive, more or less just like any other migrant. However, his status as a migrant struggling to survive is put into question when he ultimately kills himself, an action completely out of character from what we are first shown. Furthermore, he leaves the other two characters in the story absolutely perplexed, who notice that at some point something with Hawker changed. The story literally ends capturing that moment of confusion when Horehead and Dyer both ask, "What the F is he doing?" By the end of this presentation, I hope to provide insight on why Hawker does what he does and the thought process that leads himself to it. The answer I came up with to my question was that in the story, Hawker, the oldest of the migrants, finally comes to terms with his fate after considering his past, present, and future. In his present, he finds himself using fire to erase the existence of the bodies of former human beings and migrants, just like him. This makes himself think to his past, where he was countlessly found in similar situations, back to when he was a soldier, and reliving the period when he joined the Paras, the years he spent wiping out whole populations, gutting pregnant women, hacking the young and old to pieces. Hawker realizes that there is no way to reconcile his past with anything he does either in the present or in the future. Dousing himself in oil and flames eventually becomes the only course of action that Hawker finds he can reasonably take in order to escape what he feels is his fate. So first I want to introduce the characters that show up in the story. There are only three main active characters in the story, and we meet them all in the beginning. Horehead and Dyer are two old men and triplets who founded the Inferno, formerly known as the Three Brothers, a rag and bone yard which is where the story takes place. The brothers' business at this point is basically to chop up and burn dead bodies delivered to them, get rid of any kind of evidence. This wasn't always what they did. Their parents had founded the scrapyard with the hope that their children could earn a livelihood with it dismantling old cars. However, Horehead acknowledges that in the world they live in, you have to adapt. If you don't, then someone else does. Hawker, another old man, is delivered into the arms of the brothers, who purchased Hawker to be their assistant in their gruesome task. They save Hawker's life for this purpose and in effect replace their lost triplet brother, who they never really give further mention to other than they're the only two that have survived. It's a constant mystery throughout the story. Furthermore, an interesting repetition that takes place throughout the story is the various times when Hawker is mentioned. First, Hawker is the oldest of the migrants who crossed the frontier to meet the hail of bullets in the mountains. And then, the oldest of all living creatures who came from other countries. And then, oldest of those creatures who left their lands days ago. I found the progression of these three quotes were interesting because they seem to dehumanize Hawker each time. First, he starts as the oldest of the migrants, then as a living creature, and finally as a creature. So as you can see, it shifts from him being recognized as like a human being, and each time stripping away a little bit of Hawker's humanity when it goes from migrant to living creature to not even a living and just to a creature. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about Hawker's resolve. At first, Hawker thanks fate and resolves not to fail these two men who saved him. He will not fail these men, but more interestingly, he says he cannot fail these men. Why is it that he cannot fail these men? One reason may be that he is simply trying to survive, and if he fails, he might be put to death. However, Hawker never really seems to think much of his mortality, other than to question why he's even still alive at the beginning of the story. The second, more convincing reason is that Hawker is overridden with guilt for having failed his fellow migrants during their difficult journey. This is made evident by him repeatedly thinking about what he did when he was traveling with the other migrants. In the first quote, you see, "This old man who contrived a promising future. I lied to them all," Hawker says to himself. And then later he says, "How could I do that to them?" And later again he says, "How could I lie to them?" Um, During his travels, Hawker had probably set himself up as a wise old palm reader of the group, and in order to raise morale, had promised a hopeful future for his fellow migrants, one in which the migrants all survive their journey and hardships and embark on a new life. However, even while spinning this story, Hawker realizes that his words would prove untrue. He then questions why he would lie and give false hope to all those people. What was the point of doing so, even when he understood what fate had in store for them? This guilt and failure is what drives Hawker to make the initial resolution not to fail Hoarhead and Dyer as well. However, just like with his journey to a promised new land and future, Hawker's resolution is doomed to failure from the start. The shift in his thought process occurs while he is working the assigned task of cutting up and burning dead the piles of dead bodies. The nature of the task brings to fore memories of Hawker's past that he had intentionally kept pushed back up until this point. In his past, Hawker had many experiences cutting and burning down all kinds of people, and he realizes that as much as he might try, he cannot change his past, or more importantly, its consequences. Hawker was a damned man, he is a damned man, and he will continue to be a damned man. No amount of resolve or false hope will change that fact. His fate and fire are one and the same. His future will also be consumed with fire, and it is with this realization that Hawker decides to the only path of escape left to him when the oldest of all migrants finally leaps headlong into the flames, much to the bewilderment of the two men who had thought to save him. So as you can see from these quotes, he's always has fate in the back of his mind and is something he always considers as a palm reader. At first, he notices it will do you no good in the end. That's what it says in the lines of his palms. This is basically saying that his future is already determined to be doomed. Then he sees again, I could see it clearly written on my palm. The past is always waiting up ahead. This is what links the future to the past. And from what he remembers and from what the readers understand, his past was one full of blood, violence, and fire. And he later then repeats the same concept. The oldest of all migrants is addressing his own fate. The past is always waiting up ahead. Once again, further linking the future with the past. And then finally, this is the last thing he says before he actually douses himself into fire and jumps into the fire, is, "It's all here, my past, my present, my future," laughs the oldest of all those who had come across the ravaged lands. This inferno is the final place where Hawker, as well as many of these dead bodies who were former migrants, are going to come to rest. So there are a few important conclusions I came to by the end of the short story. First is that Hawker's fate may be representative of that of all the other migrants. This fate is one characterized by hopelessness and ceaseless suffering, which is evident by the bodies of the migrants that end up piling in the Inferno and Hawker's final action, in which he is saved only to end up also being consumed by the fires of the Inferno. So although Hawker did survive initially as the oldest migrant to come across the bullets waiting in the mountain, he ends up having the same fate. In this cruel world, only people lucky enough to adapt to their situations, people like Horehead and Dyer, are able to survive, and the migrants are not one of those people. Second is the repetition of the use of the word old when mentioning Hawker, or even Horehead and Dyer. I'm not sure if in the original language old has a special connotation to it or not, because it's mentioned every single time in relation to those characters. However, from the English translation, it seems to suggest that the characters that are described as old have a broad range of experiences and represent the world they live in, which would support my first conclusion that Hawker's fate is like that of the other migrants. He is representative as the oldest of the other migrants. And finally is the significance of the Inferno, the location in which the story takes place. Although initially established as the Three Brothers, a place that was meant for honest work in dismantling old parts and salvaging old metal, one of the brothers has been lost, which it remains a mystery, and the location renamed the Inferno to match its new business. The world has actually forced this adaptation on the yard, which is where bodies, dead and in Hawker's case alive, end up burning to nothing but ashes. Thank you.